Black boy goes to his mom's grave and said, "Get up, mommy, I'm hungry." The unexpected happened. The morning mist hung heavy over Greenwood Cemetery like a gray blanket, muffling the sounds of the waking city beyond its iron gates. Dewdrops clung to weathered headstones, and the air carried the earthy scent of damp soil mixed with dying flowers left by grieving visitors. It was the kind of morning where even the living felt like ghosts wandering among the dead. Alexander Grant adjusted his black cashmere coat and checked his Rolex. 7:30 a.m. He preferred these early visits to his family's mausoleum when the cemetery was empty, away from prying eyes and clicking cameras. At 52, he had built an empire worth billions, but even empires needed their secrets buried deep. His Italian leather shoes clicked softly against the cobblestone path as he made his way toward the Grant family plot. The massive marble mausoleum stood like a small palace among the graves, carved with angels whose stone eyes seemed to follow visitors with judgment. Inside lay 3 generations of Grants: his grandfather who started the family fortune, his parents who expanded it, and soon, perhaps himself. But as Alexander approached the familiar sight, something unusual caught his attention. A small figure was hunched over a simple grave about 50 yards away from his family's grand monument. The contrast was striking. Where the Grant mausoleum gleamed white with gold inscriptions and elaborate sculptures, this grave was marked only by a plain wooden cross and a handful of wilted wildflowers. Alexander paused, squinting through the morning haze. It was a child, a little boy who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. His clothes were too big for his thin frame, a faded red jacket that had seen better days hanging loose on his small shoulders. His dark skin glistened with dew, and his small hands were pressed together as if in prayer. Something about the scene made Alexander's chest tighten. Perhaps it was the way the boy's shoulders shook slightly, or how utterly alone he looked in that vast field of the dead. Alexander had seen poverty before, had written checks to charities and attended fundraising galas, but there was something raw and immediate about this moment that stopped him in his tracks. The boy's voice drifted across the quiet cemetery, barely above a whisper but clear in the stillness. "Mommy, please. I know you're sleeping, but I'm really hungry." Alexander felt his breath catch. The words hit him like a physical blow, each syllable carrying a weight of innocence and desperation that made his expensive breakfast threaten to come back up. "I tried to find some food yesterday," the boy continued, his voice cracking. "Mrs. Johnson gave me half a sandwich, but that was 2 days ago. My tummy hurts real bad, Mommy. I know you always said not to beg, but I don't know what else to do." The businessman found himself taking a step closer, drawn by a force he couldn't understand. His own family visits had always been formal affairs, laying expensive flowers, saying a few respectful words, and leaving quickly. But this child was having a real conversation with his deceased mother, pouring out his heart as if she might actually answer. "Remember how you used to make those pancakes on Sunday mornings?" the boy whispered, his small fingers tracing the letters carved into the wooden cross. "You'd put those little chocolate chips in them and make funny faces with the syrup. I dream about those pancakes, Mommy. Sometimes I wake up and I can almost smell them." Alexander's hand instinctively moved to his pocket where his phone waited. He could call his driver, have the boy taken to social services, write a check to ensure he was fed. It would be the responsible thing to do, the clean, efficient solution that powerful men like him were known for. But something held him back. Maybe it was the way the morning light caught the boy's profile, or perhaps it was just a trick of memory, but Alexander felt a jolt of recognition shoot through him like lightning. The shape of the child's nose, the curve of his jaw, even the way he held his small shoulders, it was all hauntingly familiar. "Get up, Mommy, please," the boy pleaded, his voice breaking into a sob. "I'm so hungry, and I'm scared. I don't want to be alone anymore. The other kids at school, they have lunch money and nice clothes and mommies who pick them up. I just want my mommy back." The words shattered something inside Alexander's carefully constructed emotional walls. His legs felt weak, and he had to grab onto a nearby headstone for support. Memories he had buried deep began clawing their way to the surface, Memories of a woman with kind eyes and a stubborn pride, a woman who had loved him but refused to be kept by him. The boy was crying now, his small body shaking with the force of his sobs. I tried to be good, Mommy. I tried to remember everything you taught me. But I'm just a little boy, and I don't know how to take care of myself. Please, just get up for a little while. Just long enough to make me some food and tell me everything's going to be okay. Alexander's vision blurred as tears he hadn't shed in decades began to form. The boy's face was clearer now in the growing daylight, and the resemblance was undeniable. The same dark eyes that looked back at him from his own mirror, the same determined set to the jaw that had helped Alexander build his fortune. I miss you so much it feels like my chest is going to break open, the boy continued. And I'm sorry I couldn't save you, Mommy. I know you got sick because you were working too hard to take care of me. If I hadn't been born, maybe you'd still be alive. Those words nearly brought Alexander to his knees. The guilt that had been eating at him for years suddenly had a face, a voice, a heartbreaking reality that he could no longer ignore. This wasn't just any hungry child in a cemetery. This was his son, his flesh and blood, alone and starving while Alexander lived in a mansion with more food than he could ever eat. The boy leaned forward and kissed the wooden cross, his tears making dark spots on the weathered wood. I love you, Mommy. I'll come back tomorrow and tell you about my day, okay? Maybe by then you'll be ready to get up. As the child slowly stood on unsteady legs, Alexander got his first full look at his son. The boy was painfully thin, his clothes hanging on his small frame like fabric on a scarecrow. His shoes had holes in them, and his hair needed cutting. But despite his poverty, despite his hunger and loneliness, there was something unbroken in his posture, a dignity that reminded Alexander so strongly of the boy's mother that it took his breath away. The boy began walking toward the cemetery entrance, his small figure growing smaller with each step. Alexander wanted to call out, wanted to run after him and scoop him up and take him home. But shame rooted him to the spot, shame for not knowing, for not searching, for letting his pride and fear keep him from the truth. As his son disappeared through the cemetery gates, Alexander sank to his knees right there among the headstones, his expensive suit forgotten, his powerful image crumbling. For the first time in his adult life, he felt completely powerless. All his money, all his influence, all his carefully built empire meant nothing in the face of what he had just witnessed. The morning sun was fully up now, burning away the mist and revealing the cemetery in harsh, clear light. Alexander looked toward his family's mausoleum, that monument to grand success and power, then back at the simple grave where his son had just poured out his heart. He had found something he didn't even know he was looking for, and the discovery was about to change everything. Alexander remained frozen on his knees for what felt like hours, though his Rolex showed only 15 minutes had passed. The cemetery had come alive around him, groundskeepers beginning their daily routines, early morning joggers passing by the gates, the distant hum of traffic growing louder as the city awakened. But Alexander heard none of it. His mind was trapped 7 years in the past, reliving memories he had buried beneath layers of business deals and social obligations. Her name had been Maya Richardson. She worked as a nurse at the Children's Hospital where Alexander's company had donated a new wing. Their first meeting was supposed to be a simple photo opportunity, the billionaire philanthropist shaking hands with grateful medical staff. Instead, he found himself captivated by a woman who looked him straight in the eye and thanked him not for his money, but for caring about sick children. Maya had been unlike anyone in Alexander's world. While other women threw themselves at his wealth and status, she seemed genuinely unimpressed by both. She drove a 15-year-old Honda, lived in a modest apartment, and wore scrubs more often than designer dresses. When he asked her out, she made him wait 3 weeks for an answer, claiming she needed to think about whether dating a man like him was wise. Their relationship had been conducted in shadows, quiet dinners at small restaurants far from his usual haunts, long walks in parks where paparazzi never ventured, stolen moments in her apartment where she cooked simple meals that tasted better than anything served at 5-star establishments. For 6 months, Alexander lived a double life, presenting his usual face to the world while discovering what it meant to be loved for who he was rather than what he owned. The memory of their last fight came crashing back with brutal clarity. Alexander could still see Maya standing in her tiny kitchen, her dark eyes blazing with anger and hurt. She was pregnant, 2 months along, and Alexander's first instinct had been to solve the problem with money. "I can take care of this," he had said, pulling out his checkbook with the casual confidence of a man who believed every problem had a price. "A nice apartment in a better neighborhood, maybe something in Connecticut. Private doctors, the best schools when the time comes. You'll never have to worry about money again." Maya's face had changed in that moment, her love transforming into something harder and more distant. "You think this is about money?" she had asked, her voice deadly quiet. "You think I got pregnant to trap you into paying my bills? That's not what I meant." Alexander had protested, but even as he said it, he knew it was exactly what he meant. In his world, everything came down to financial transactions. Love was expensive jewelry, loyalty was stock options, and problems were solved with wire transfers. "Get out," Maya had said, her hand protectively covering her still flat stomach. "Get out and don't come back. My child will never be your charity case." Alexander had left, telling himself she would change her mind. Women always did when faced with the reality of raising a child alone. He waited for the phone call that never came, the plea for help that his pride expected. Instead, Maya had vanished from his life as completely as if she had never existed. Now, 7 years later, Alexander understood with crushing clarity what his arrogance had cost him. Maya had been too proud to ask for help, too strong to come crawling back to a man who had reduced their love to a business arrangement. She had raised their son alone, worked herself to death to provide for him, and taken her secrets to the grave. Rising shakily to his feet, Alexander walked to the cemetery office, a small building near the entrance where records were kept and plots were sold. The elderly groundskeeper, a weathered man named Henry who had worked at Greenwood for 30 years, looked up from his coffee with surprise. "Mr. Grant? You're here early today. Everything all right with your family plot?" "That boy who was here this morning," Alexander said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "At the grave with the wooden cross. Do you know anything about him?" Henry's face softened with sympathy. "Little Jaden? Poor child comes here every morning before school, sometimes in the evening too. His mama, Maya Richardson, she's buried in the paupers section. Died about 6 months ago from pneumonia, though between you and me, I think it was exhaustion that really killed her." The name hit Alexander like a physical blow. "Maya Richardson," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Sweet woman," Henry continued, unaware of Alexander's distress. "Worked 3 jobs trying to keep that boy fed and housed. Never complained, never asked for charity. Real proud lady. When she got sick, she kept working right up until the end. Collapsed at the hospital where she worked nights cleaning floors." Alexander's legs gave out, and he sank into a chair beside Henry's desk. "What about the boy? Where is he living now?" Henry shrugged sadly. "Foster care was supposed to take him, but he keeps running away. Kid's got no other family, Maya never mentioned a father. He's been living rough, sleeping in that abandoned building on Maple Street. Some of the neighbors try to help when they can, but they don't have much themselves." The full weight of his failure crashed down on Alexander. While he had been building his empire, attending charity galas and writing checks to feel good about himself, his son had been sleeping in abandoned buildings and begging his dead mother to wake up and feed him. "I have to go," Alexander said abruptly, stumbling toward the door. "Mr. Grant? You sure you're all right? You look pale as a ghost." But Alexander was already gone, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. He had failed Maya, failed their son, failed himself. But it wasn't too late. It couldn't be too late. For the first time in years, Alexander Grant had found something more important than money. He had found his son. For 3 weeks, Alexander became a ghost in his own life. His board meetings turned into hurried affairs where he signed documents without reading them. His secretary fielded calls from confused business partners who couldn't understand why the sharp, decisive Alexander Grant had become distracted and unreachable. His penthouse apartment, once his sanctuary of success, now felt like a prison of guilt. Every morning at dawn, Alexander would park his sleek black Mercedes 3 blocks from Maple Street, then walk through the maze of narrow alleys and crumbling buildings that made up the city's forgotten neighborhood. He learned to dress down: old jeans, worn sneakers, baseball caps pulled low, anything to blend into a world where his usual $1,000 suits would mark him as an intruder. The abandoned building where Jaden lived was a skeleton of what had once been a small apartment complex. Broken windows were covered with cardboard, graffiti decorated the walls, and the front steps sagged under years of neglect. Alexander watched from across the street as his son emerged each morning, his small figure moving with the careful alertness of someone who had learned too young that the world was dangerous. Jaden had created routines that broke Alexander's heart. The boy would check 3 different dumpsters behind restaurants, looking for food that was still edible. He had befriended a stray dog, a scraggly mutt he called Rusty, and they shared whatever scraps they found. At exactly 7:45 a.m., Jaden would arrive at Lincoln Elementary, where a kind teacher named Ms. Rodriguez would quietly slip him a granola bar or an apple, pretending it was left over from her own breakfast. Alexander's first act of intervention was small. He waited until Jaden left for school, then approached the building manager of a nearby apartment complex. For $500 cash, the man agreed to leave a bag of groceries by the building's back entrance every few days: bread, peanut butter, canned soup, fruit. Nothing fancy, nothing that would seem suspicious. When Jaden discovered the first bag, Alexander watched from his hiding spot as the boy looked around frantically, searching for the source of this unexpected gift. The child's reaction surprised him. Instead of immediately digging into the food, Jaden carefully divided everything into portions, wrapping some items to save for later. Even in his desperation, the boy showed a wisdom and self-control that humbled his billionaire father. "Thank you, Mommy," Jaden whispered to the sky that first day, clutching a can of soup to his chest. "I knew you were watching over me." The words nearly brought Alexander to his knees. His son believed his dead mother's spirit was providing for him, and somehow that made Alexander's anonymous gifts feel both more meaningful and more heartbreaking. As days passed, Alexander's interventions grew bolder. He discovered that Jaden's school shoes had completely worn through the soles, so he arranged for a local charity to donate new clothes and shoes to Lincoln Elementary, specifically requesting they go to the most needy student in 2nd grade. When Jaden arrived at school to find a box with his name on it, his joy was so pure and radiant that Alexander had to step into an alley to compose himself. The boy's teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, noticed the changes. Alexander overheard her talking to another teacher during lunch break. "It's the strangest thing. Jaden Richardson has been getting anonymous help for weeks now. New shoes, regular meals, even his school fees were paid by someone who insisted on remaining nameless. The boy thinks it's his mother's spirit, and honestly, I don't have the heart to tell him otherwise." But Alexander's secret mission came with unexpected challenges. His late-night drives to Maple Street were noticed by his security team. His frequent cash withdrawals raised flags with his accountant. Most dangerously, his emotional state was becoming impossible to hide. During a board meeting, Alexander found himself staring out the window, wondering if Jaden had found the sandwich he'd arranged to have left on the school playground. His distraction was so obvious that his business partner, Richard Blackwell, pulled him aside afterward. "Alex, what's going on with you? You haven't been yourself for weeks. The Hong Kong deal fell through because you forgot to return their calls. The Charity Gala Planning Committee says you haven't responded to a single email. Are you sick?" Alexander almost laughed at the question. Sick? Yes, he was sick, sick with guilt, sick with longing, sick with the knowledge that his son was growing up 20 minutes away from his mansion, believing his dead mother was sending him help from beyond the grave. One evening, while watching Jaden share his dinner with the stray dog Rusty, Alexander made a decision that terrified him. It was time to test something more dangerous than anonymous food deliveries. He wanted to see how his son would react to direct kindness from a stranger. The next morning, Alexander positioned himself along Jaden's route to school. When the boy appeared, walking with his usual careful steps, Alexander approached cautiously. "Excuse me," he said, his voice trembling despite his efforts to sound casual. "I think you dropped this." Alexander held out a $20 bill, knowing full well it wasn't Jaden's. The boy looked up at him with those familiar dark eyes, his own eyes, and Alexander felt his world shift on its axis. "That's not mine, mister," Jaden said politely. "I don't have any money to drop." The honesty in that simple statement nearly undid Alexander completely. Here was a child who was literally starving, and yet he wouldn't take money that didn't belong to him. "Well," Alexander said, fighting to keep his voice steady, "maybe it's meant for you anyway. Sometimes good things just happen." Jaden considered this with the seriousness of a child who had learned to think carefully about everything. Finally, he smiled, and Alexander saw Maya's smile reflected in his son's face. "Maybe it's from my mommy," Jaden said softly. "She always finds ways to take care of me." As his son walked away, clutching the $20 like a treasure, Alexander realized his silent tests had revealed something profound. Jaden wasn't just surviving, he was maintaining his integrity, his kindness, his capacity for gratitude despite everything he had endured. The boy was his mother's son, and Alexander had never been prouder or more ashamed in his life. Alexander's secret life began unraveling on a Tuesday morning when his driver, Marcus, made an innocent observation that sent shockwaves through the Grant empire. "Mr. Grant, I noticed you've been requesting rides to some unusual neighborhoods lately," Marcus said as they sat in traffic. "That area around Maple Street, it's not exactly safe, sir. Perhaps I should accompany you next time?" Alexander's blood ran cold. If Marcus had noticed, others would too. In his world, information was currency, and secrets were weaknesses that enemies exploited without mercy. His frequent trips to the poor side of town wouldn't stay hidden much longer. His fears proved justified that very afternoon. Richard Blackwell, his business partner and oldest friend, burst into Alexander's office without knocking, a breach of protocol that immediately signaled trouble. "We need to talk," Richard said, closing the door behind him with deliberate force. "What the hell is going on with you, Alex? And don't give me another excuse about being tired or stressed. I've had private investigators tracking your movements for the past week." Alexander's hands clenched into fists. "You had me followed? Damn right I did. You've been acting like a man having a nervous breakdown, making strange cash withdrawals, disappearing for hours at a time, visiting slums where you could get mugged or worse. The board is getting nervous, Alex. Your behavior is erratic, and erratic behavior affects stock prices. My personal life is none of the board's business." Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your personal life? Is that what you call sneaking around poor neighborhoods like some kind of philanthropic vigilante? The investigators tell me you've been watching some homeless kid. Jesus, Alex, please tell me you're not having some kind of midlife crisis involving—" "Stop," Alexander's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Whatever you think you know, you're wrong. Then explain it to me. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're either losing your mind or you're involved in something that could destroy everything we've built." Before Alexander could respond, his secretary's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Grant? Your cousin Patricia is here with several board members. They're requesting an immediate meeting." Alexander's stomach dropped. Patricia Grant Wellington was his father's brother's daughter, a sharp-tongued woman who had always resented Alexander's control of the family fortune. If she was here with board members, it meant the wolves were circling. The conference room felt like a courtroom when Alexander entered. Patricia sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by 5 board members whose expressions ranged from concerned to hostile. Their expensive suits and cold eyes represented everything Alexander had once valued: power, control, the ruthless efficiency of wealth protecting itself. "Alexander," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false concern, "we need to discuss your recent behavior and its impact on Grant Industries." "What behavior would that be, Patricia?" She slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were photographs. Alexander in his disguise, watching Jaden from across the street, approaching the boy with the $20 bill, entering the cemetery at dawn. Someone had been very thorough in documenting his secret life. These photos raise serious questions about your judgment and mental stability. Patricia continued. You've been stalking a homeless child, Alex. Do you understand how this looks? How it could be interpreted by the media, by our competitors, by law enforcement. Board member Harrison Webb, a thin man with silver hair and calculating eyes, leaned forward. The company's reputation is at stake, Alexander. We can't have our CEO linked to any scandal involving children. The liability alone could cost us millions. There's no scandal, Alexander said through gritted teeth. That boy is. Is what? Patricia interrupted. Some charity case you've become obsessed with? Some project to ease your guilty conscience? Whatever twisted reason you have for following this child around, it needs to stop immediately. The word twisted hit Alexander like a slap. These people, his own family, his trusted advisors, were so quick to assume the worst, to reduce his desperate attempt to connect with his son into something sordid and shameful. Perhaps, said another board member, Margaret Chin, her voice clinically cold, it would be best if Alexander took a leave of absence. A mental health break. We could spin it as exhaustion from overwork. I'm not taking any leave of absence, Alexander said, his voice rising. And I'm certainly not going to be lectured about morality by people who've never cared about anything beyond their quarterly dividends. Patricia's eyes glittered with triumph. So you admit there's something immoral about your behavior? The trap was perfectly laid, and Alexander realized too late that he'd walked right into it. Anything he said now would be twisted against him. If he revealed the truth about Jaden, they'd find ways to use it as leverage. If he denied wrongdoing, they'd paint him as a liar and potentially dangerous. The meeting was interrupted by Alexander's phone buzzing with an urgent text from Marcus. Emergency at Maple Street. The boy collapsed. Ambulance taking him to General Hospital. Alexander's world tilted on its axis. Nothing else mattered, not the board, not the company, not the photographs or threats or political maneuvering. His son was in danger. He stood up so abruptly that his chair toppled backward. This meeting is over. Alexander! Patricia called after him. Where are you going? We're not finished here. But he was already gone, racing through the hallway toward the elevator, his mind focused on only one thing, getting to the hospital before it was too late. Behind him, he could hear the board members' voices rising in anger and confusion, their carefully planned ambush falling apart as their target disappeared. As the elevator doors closed, Alexander caught a glimpse of Patricia's face, shocked, furious, but also calculating. She was already planning her next move, already figuring out how to use his sudden departure against him. Let her try, Alexander thought as the elevator plummeted toward the parking garage. Let them all try to destroy him if they wanted. He had spent 7 years being the kind of man who put business before everything else, and it had cost him the only woman he'd ever truly loved. He wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Not when his son's life was hanging in the balance. The emergency room at General Hospital smelled like disinfectant and desperation. Alexander burst through the sliding doors like a man possessed, his expensive suit wrinkled from his frantic drive across the city. He'd broken every speed limit, run 3 red lights, and abandoned his Mercedes in a handicapped space without a second thought. Jaden Richardson, he gasped to the nurse at the reception desk. A 7-year-old boy, brought in by ambulance. Please, I need to know. Are you family? The nurse asked, her fingers poised over the keyboard. The question hit Alexander like a physical blow. Family? Yes, he was family, the most important family the boy had left in the world. But he had no legal right to be here, no documentation to prove his claim, no way to explain his connection without revealing secrets that could destroy them both. Alexander struggled for words that wouldn't sound insane. I'm a friend. I've been helping him. Please, just tell me if he's okay. The nurse's expression softened slightly. The boy is stable. Severe malnutrition and dehydration. He collapsed on the street near his school. A teacher brought him in. Relief flooded through Alexander so powerfully that his knees nearly buckled. Alive. Jaden was alive. Can I see him? Room 314, but visiting hours. Alexander was already moving toward the elevators before she could finish. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his heart pounding with fear and guilt and desperate love. This was his fault. While he'd been playing games with anonymous gifts and secret surveillance, his son had been slowly starving to death. Room 314 was small and sterile, dominated by machines that beeped softly in the fluorescent light. Jaden looked impossibly tiny in the hospital bed, for tubes snaking from his thin arms, his dark skin pale against the white sheets. Ms. Rodriguez, his teacher, sat in a chair beside the bed, her eyes red from crying. "Thank God," she whispered when she saw Alexander. "Are you the man who's been helping him? The one who's been leaving the food and paying his school fees?" Alexander nodded, not trusting his voice. Up close, the evidence of Jaden's suffering was undeniable. The boy's cheeks were hollow, his arms stick-thin, his breathing shallow but steady. "The doctors say he'll recover," Ms. Rodriguez continued. "But they're talking about placing him in state care immediately. They say he can't continue living on the streets." Her voice broke. "He's such a good boy. He doesn't deserve this." Alexander moved closer to the bed, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch his son's face. Jaden's skin was warm but too fragile, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones that shouldn't exist on a 7-year-old. "Hey, buddy," Alexander whispered, his voice cracking. Jaden's eyes fluttered open, those familiar dark eyes that Alexander saw in his own mirror every morning. For a moment, the boy looked confused, trying to focus on Alexander's face. "Are you an angel?" Jaden asked weakly. "Mommy said angels watch over me." The words shattered Alexander completely. Tears he'd been holding back for weeks finally broke free, streaming down his face as he struggled to breathe. "No, sweetheart. I'm not an angel." "Then who are you? You look familiar." Alexander glanced at Ms. Rodriguez, who was watching the interaction with growing understanding in her eyes. There was no going back now. No more lies, no more hiding, no more letting his son suffer while he played elaborate games of anonymous charity. "Jaden," Alexander said, taking the boy's small hand in his own. "I need to tell you something very important. Something about who I am." The boy's eyes widened slightly, some instinct telling him this moment was significant. "I'm your father." The words hung in the air like a prayer. Ms. Rodriguez gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Jaden stared at Alexander with a mixture of confusion and desperate hope. "My daddy?" Jaden whispered. "But Mommy said my daddy was gone. She said he had important work to do." "She was right," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "I did have work to do. But I was wrong to think that work was more important than you. I was wrong about everything." Jaden's thin fingers tightened around Alexander's hand. "Are you going to leave again? Like everyone else?" The question cut deeper than any business rival's attack, any board member's threat, any family betrayal. This child, his son, had learned at 7 years old to expect abandonment. Had learned that people who claimed to care would eventually walk away. "Never," Alexander said, the word coming out like a vow. "I will never leave you again, Jaden. I promise you that. I'm going to take care of you the way I should have from the beginning. But what about Mommy? She's all alone in the cemetery." Alexander's heart broke all over again. Even in his weakened state, Jaden was worried about his dead mother's loneliness. "We'll visit her together," Alexander promised. "Every day if you want. We'll tell her about your day, about how you're doing in school, about all the things that happen. She'll never be alone because we'll never forget her." Jaden studied Alexander's face with the serious intensity that reminded him so much of Maya. "Will you stay with me now?" "I'm scared of being alone. I'm not going anywhere," Alexander said, settling into the chair beside the bed. "I'm going to stay right here until you're better, and then I'm going to take you home." Where's home? Jaden asked sleepily, the medication and exhaustion beginning to pull him back towards sleep. Alexander looked at his son, really looked at him for the first time as his father rather than a guilty stranger. Home is wherever we're together. As Jaden's eyes drifted closed, his small hand still clutching Alexander's, the hospital room door opened. Patricia Grant Wellington stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 board members and a photographer whose camera was already clicking. Well, Patricia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. This is unexpected. Alexander Grant, family man? Alexander didn't let go of his son's hand. Let them take their pictures. Let them spread their gossip and make their threats. For the first time in his adult life, he knew exactly where he belonged. Get out, he said quietly, his eyes never leaving Jaden's peaceful face. But he knew this was only the beginning. The real battle was about to start. The photographer's camera flashed 3 more times before Alexander stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He had spent his entire adult life calculating risks and managing public perception, but as he looked at his sleeping son, those old instincts felt like artifacts from another man's life. I said get out, Alexander repeated, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had built empires and toppled competitors. Patricia's smile was razor sharp. Oh, Alexander. You've really outdone yourself this time. The headlines write themselves. Billionaire CEO's secret love child lives in poverty while father builds fortune. The board will have no choice but to remove you immediately. Let them try. The simplicity of his response seemed to catch Patricia off guard. She had expected panic, desperate negotiations, perhaps even bribery. Instead, Alexander Grant, the man who had never made a move without considering 18 different angles, seemed almost serene. You don't understand, Patricia pressed. This scandal will destroy you. Your reputation, your company, your entire legacy. My legacy, Alexander interrupted, is sleeping in that bed. 2 weeks later, Alexander stood before a packed conference room at Grant Industries headquarters. Every major business journalist in the city was present, cameras rolling, phones recording. The board members sat at the long table like judges at a trial, their faces ranging from smugly satisfied to nervously uncertain. Patricia had orchestrated this press conference as Alexander's public execution. She expected him to resign quietly, perhaps offer some excuse about personal health issues, and fade away while she assumed control of the company. Instead, Alexander had called the press conference himself. Ladies and gentlemen, Alexander began, his voice clear and strong. I've asked you here today to address recent speculation about my personal life and to make an important announcement about the future of Grant Industries. The room was dead silent except for the quiet whir of cameras. 7 years ago, I failed someone I loved. I let pride and fear drive away a remarkable woman named Maya Richardson, and in doing so, I abandoned my responsibilities as a father to our son, Jaden. His voice cracked slightly on his son's name, but he continued steadily. Maya died 6 months ago, and my son has been living in poverty while I lived in luxury, unaware of his existence. Murmurs rippled through the crowd of journalists. This wasn't the carefully managed corporate speak they had expected. Some of you may see this as a scandal. I see it as the most important truth of my life. My son is brilliant, brave, and kind despite everything he's endured. He has shown me what real strength looks like, what real priorities should be. Alexander paused, looking directly at Patricia, whose confident smirk was rapidly fading. Effective immediately, I am establishing the Maya Richardson Foundation with an initial endowment of $500 million. This foundation will provide housing, education, and support for children who have lost parents, ensuring that no child in our city will ever have to choose between hunger and dignity. The room erupted. Journalists shouted questions, board members looked stunned, and Patricia's face had gone pale with rage. Furthermore, Alexander continued, raising his voice above the chaos, I am donating 60% of my personal shares in Grant Industries to this foundation. The remaining 40% will be held in trust for my son until he reaches adulthood. Alexander! Patricia screamed, jumping to her feet. You can't do this. The board will never approve. The board, Alexander said calmly, no longer has a choice. As majority shareholder through the foundation, I am restructuring this company's priorities. We will still be profitable, but we will also be accountable to something greater than quarterly earnings. One journalist managed to shout above the din. Mr. Grant, what do you say to critics who claim this is just damage control? Alexander smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. I say they're partially right. I am trying to control damage. The damage I caused by being the kind of man who measured worth in dollar signs instead of love. The damage I caused by letting fear make my decisions. The damage I caused by forgetting that the most important legacy any person can leave is the children they raise and the love they give. 3 months later, Alexander knelt beside a familiar grave in Greenwood Cemetery. But this time, he wasn't alone. Jaden stood beside him, healthy and strong, wearing clothes that fit properly and shoes without holes. The boy's hand rested securely in his father's, no longer afraid of abandonment. The simple wooden cross had been replaced with a beautiful marble headstone that read, Maya Richardson, beloved mother, devoted nurse, woman of extraordinary strength. We brought you flowers, Mommy, Jaden said softly, placing a bouquet of sunflowers, Maya's favorites, on the grave. Daddy says you would have liked our new house. It has a big kitchen where we make pancakes on Sunday mornings. Alexander squeezed his son's hand gently. And we're learning to make them with chocolate chips, just like you used to. Jaden looked up at his father with eyes that sparkled with life and security. Daddy, do you think Mommy knows we're together now? Alexander looked at the headstone, then at his son, this miracle child who had taught him what really mattered in life. In the distance, he could see the Grant family mausoleum, that monument to wealth and power that had once seemed so important. It looked smaller now, less impressive, just another collection of stone and marble in a field full of people who had found their way home. Yes, buddy, Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion and certainty. I think she knows. And I think she's proud of both of us. Jaden smiled and turned back to the grave. You can rest now, Mommy, he whispered. Daddy's here, and he's never going away again. As father and son stood together in the morning sunlight, Alexander realized that he had finally found what he'd been searching for his entire life. Not in boardrooms or bank accounts or business deals, but in the simple, profound act of being present for the person who needed him most. He had lost an empire but gained a kingdom. He had found his way home.